Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There were so many contradictions in what the Minister just presented to the House around this amendment, and I want to go through some of them, because if this is genuinely about targeting, about offering a service to those young people who need it, and if it is genuinely about reducing the future liability, I hate that term, I'd rather see us focusing on the potential of these young people, but if it is about reducing that future liability, why not offer the service to any young people who wish to access it? If it is genuinely going to do that, have that positive turnaround in that young person's life, if it's genuinely going to reduce the liability, the cost to the state in the long term, why would we allow it to only be on the state's terms? It's if the state determines that you're a risk. If the state decides that you are going to cost, you as in the young person is going to cost the Crown money in the future, why, if this is as good a program and approach as the Minister has outlined, would we not want to open it up? And I have to hark back, Mr. Chair, because I was one of the critics of the youth service approach. I'm very open about that. When we first debated this in the House, we had some real concerns. We had some concerns that we would change the relationship between youth workers who might predominantly offer this program because they had some powers over the resources that young people would be able to access, that would be taken from usually a work and income perspective, and it would be handed to someone who was actually meant to maintain a relationship day to day. That was one of our concerns. The other concern that we had was that it did take a deficit approach, and everyone carte blanche was put on payment cards rather than the reverse approach of those who only need it most. At a point it's identified that they need it, and I continue to maintain that I see young people, particularly young mothers, budget like no one else. And I would really rival anyone to demonstrate how they could do what some of these young people do. So we did have concerns. But I went into conversations with youth service providers and youth service recipient of services with an open mind once it was implemented, and asked them what their view of those services were. And in some areas, there were young people who relayed to me that they were having a positive experience. They had qualms with the way the payment card operated, the limitations of it, all of those valid. But in terms of the one-on-one service they were receiving, some of them said actually would like a bit more time. So on that front, I acknowledge, Minister, that actually this was a debate worth having. But what I wanted to hear was a really clear message on why we should default back to this risk identifier model, which I have fundamental issues with the fact that the government keeps leaning on, because we're excluding young people as a result. And this started when we got rid of the youth transition services. We used to have a service that said to any young person, roughly under the age of 24 actually, it said to any young person, if you need support, if you're not in employment, education or training, if you need support, regardless of your circumstance, regardless of where you live, regardless of whether you're on a benefit or not, you might be being supported by friends, couch surfing, whatever, because we knew how difficult it was in those days and continues to be in those days to get the unsupported living benefit. It was terribly difficult. You could be in a violent situation and not be able to receive it. So no matter where your resource was coming from, you could access that service. And instead we got rid of it, and we narrowed the focus into these high-risk, high-liability young people. And look at what the numbers have done since then. In that time, we've now at a situation where the number of young people not in education, training or employment, as much as the government says we're through the GFC and we've got rosy times ahead, is at 87,200 young people. So actually, it hasn't worked. We've got 6,500 more NEETs now than when National took office and changed fundamentally the environment of support for those young people. Targeting in that manner has failed, Minister. It's failed. So why would we entrench it further? If you believe, Minister, in the findings that were presented in 2014, so very early days, the evaluation of the youth services, which found that the youth services having a positive impact on assisting young people to increase their education levels and be independent of welfare and support. I'm reading here from some of the information, Mr Chair,
Jacinda Ardern.
provided to the Select Committee. It found that nearly 2/3, 63% of participants increased the number of NCEA credits they held in the first 12 months of participating. At the end of March 2014, 30% transitioned to a working age benefit, whereas it was 38% of the comparison group, so a difference of about 8%. But if we were seeing outcomes in those other areas that were positive, why not allow anyone who wanted to access the service to access it? Why wouldn't you? And I still haven't seen compelling evidence as to why that might be. I can see the rationale. The department has set it out. Their argument has been, and I quote, that the extension only includes 18 and 19-year-old beneficiaries at significant risk of long-term welfare dependency, because not all 18 and 19-year-old beneficiaries need the wraparound support that the youth service provides. Where's the evidence to demonstrate that? If you're an 18 or 19-year-old and you're not in employment, education or training, I'd say they deserve some support. So what is the difference here that we've identified that says that they don't need that support? That actually they're just fine transitioning back into the usual humdrum motions of work and income when they may choose to want to opt into a youth service approach. And then I think we come to the real reason, where it states, because the youth service is a costly and intensive service. It's costly and intensive. So here we suddenly see the real reason why we're taking such a narrow focus. And how many people are actually talking about? Well, according to what I've seen from MSD, we're talking about the targeted approach is roughly going to mean about 2,000 young people. 2,000 young people when we have 87,000 who are not in employment, education or training. Roughly 2,000 in that 18 to 19-year-old cohort will be eligible under this risk criteria that the government has created. Those are the only ones who will be eligible for that intensive wraparound support. Well, actually, there's a pile of contradictions, though, and even the Minister articulated them, around the cost of this program versus the cost savings. And again, here we see this really narrow view of we're spending too much on this, we can only offer it for a narrow number of people, and yet, on the other hand, we'll justify it by saying how much money we'll save. So it can't be both. And I found in the regulatory impact statement, it looks like, according to this, that around 14,000 young people are involved with youth service, and it costs $148 million over 4 years. There isn't any discussion there about what element of that would have been otherwise offered via work and income, so it's hard to know if that on its own is its own line item, or if actually that's cost we otherwise would have had just within a work and income context. So we know that's the cost of it. But then flip over the other page and it states, a very preliminary estimate is that for every dollar spent on the youth service, again the word, the liability reduces by $2.53. So for every dollar we spend, apparently the liability, remembering we're talking about humans, but the liability of those humans, the cost of them to us, we will save $2.53. Now, putting aside the language, the argument therefore seems to be if we spend $148 million, we then end up saving $374 million on that calculation. If that is true, why would we not open this up to more young people? So you cannot have both. Either it's too expensive and doesn't work very well and so we'll only do it for 2,000 people, or it's great, it's boy wonder, as it were, and we actually should be extending it to everyone. Well, look, we're going to test the mantle on this one by putting up an SOP that does just that. And that's what I want to just finish on speaking to. Carmel Sepuloni has in her name an amendment which would allow services to be extended to a greater range of young people. If they're basically on an opt-in basis. And that extension, we think is right, because it was what we had with the old youth transitions model. It was what the Mayor's Task Force for Jobs recommended through the Youth Connections model, the provision of service for any young person that needs it. In fact, I would say they shouldn't have to be on a benefit, because we know how difficult it is to reach eligibility. And I want to finish on this reflection. When we did have the form of the independent youth benefit, there was one tick box that could preclude you from accessing that benefit, and that was if you answered the question in the positive. If you said when asked, could you live at home? If you said yes, you were out. Tick boxes preclude young people.
Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.